Hi, welcome back to Everyday Arrays. Today I've decided to make a video about cylinder heads from 2004 all the way to 2010. And the reason I've decided to make this video because once in a blue moon I get messages regarding cylinder heads, something like this. Hey, can I put a Gen 3 cylinder head on my Gen 1 bike? Or hey, can I put Gen 1 cylinder head on my Gen 2 bike? And the answer is sort of yes and no. They do bolt up physically. They take the same head gasket and the surfaces are identical, well, almost identical. But there are a few things you got to do. So, let me tell you what you have to do to make the cylinder heads work. And the reason people want to swap the cylinder heads, there are probably two reasons. Reason number one is, hey, swap the cylinder head from a bike that made more power and you're going to pick up some power. Hey, it's a no-brainer. The second reason is probably because availability. For example, if your Gen 2 bike dropped a valve, like my bike did, and the only thing that you can find is a Gen 3 cylinder head for sale or a Gen 1, you kind of want to know if they do work. The reason for that is usually the Gen 3 cylinder head is the most common because it was made for 3 years instead of 2 years for Gen 2 and 2 years for Gen 1 bikes. Another thing is the Gen 3 is the newest one. So the cylinder heads probably have less miles and they're usually in better condition than Gen 2 and Gen 1. So before I tell you what you have to change, you have to first I'm going to tell you how to tell the difference between them. So if you do decide to buy a different generation cylinder head, you buy the right one. So let's start with the Gen 1 cylinder head. It has no markings. So if you bought the cylinder, if you buy the cylinder head from 2004 to 2010 and it has no markings on the intake side, that means that it's a Gen 1 cylinder head, which is 2004 to 2005. Now, Gen 2 cylinder head has a B stamped right between intake port number 3 and 4. So if you see a B stamped on it, that means it's a Gen 2, which is a 2006 and 2007 cylinder head. Let's move on to Gen 3. Gen 3 has a C stamped right between intake port number 3 and number 4, just like Gen 2 bike. So if you want to buy a Gen 3 head, look for a C. If you want to buy a Gen 2 head, look for a B. If you want to buy a Gen 1 head, there are no markings. Make sure it doesn't have B or C on it. So, next, the first thing that you have to change is the thermostat housing. On Gen 1 bikes, the thermostat housing has a nipple that faces left. Gen 2 and Gen 3 cylinder heads, they come with the thermostat housing that has this nipple facing right. So if you want to swap Gen 2 or Gen 3 cylinder head on a Gen 1 bike, you have to make sure that you put Gen 1 thermostat housing on the Gen 2 head or Gen 3 head. Otherwise, you have to reroute the coolant line that goes all the way to the radiator. So the next thing that you have to swap if you're changing different cylinder heads is the intake boots. You have to keep the intake boot that came original with the cylinder head. So if you're trying to put Gen 3 head on a Gen 1 engine, you have to have Gen 3 intake boots. If you're trying to put Gen 2 cylinder head on a Gen 1 bike, you gotta have Gen 2 intake boots. And the reason for that is because the intake ports are a little bit different. So let's look at the Gen 1 intake port. It's kind of small and round. The Gen 2 intake port is a little bit bigger and round, and Gen 3 cylinder head is more of a oval shape. So here I have a Gen 2 intake boots, and let me show you what happens when you bolt it on. It matches up pretty much perfectly to the cylinder head, but if you decide to put Gen 3 cylinder head on the Gen 2 engine, and you decided to put Gen 2 boots on the head, this is what's going to happen. As you can see, since the port is oval, it would have metal sticking out here, which is not good. And on the sides, the rubber boot actually will cover part of the port. So you're definitely not going to make any power doing this. So the easiest way is to keep the same boots original to the cylinder head. So if you keep the Gen 2 boots on the Gen 2 head, and keep Gen 3 boots on the Gen 3 head, and Gen 1 boots stay on the Gen 1 head. Alright, next, one more thing. Coolant temperature sensors, they're all the same. You can swap them out or you can keep original one. Don't make no difference. So next, let's look at the combustion chambers. Alright, so this part is pretty much the same. It bolts up to the engine, no problem. There's only one difference. A Gen 3 head has more material on the cylinder head, so it has a smaller combustion chamber. That will raise your static compression. A Gen 2 cylinder head, there we go. It has less material, just like Gen 1 cylinder head. You can see the material stops right here and right here, and this one goes all the way. So just so you know, Gen 3 head, smaller combustion chamber. Gen 2 and Gen 1 head, same combustion chambers. So Gen 3, the way to go. If you're doing a naturally aspirated build, it'll raise the compression, give you a couple of horses. Alright, so next, let's talk about the valves. So Gen 1 head came with the biggest valves. It came with the 31 millimeter intake valves and 25.5 millimeter exhaust valves. Now the Gen 2 cylinder head came with a smaller intake valve by 1 millimeter. So 30 millimeter intake valves and 25.5 millimeter exhaust valves. Gen 3 head came with the smallest intake and exhaust ports compared to the other two. So it has 30 millimeter intake valves and 24.5 millimeter exhaust valves. So Gen 3 bikes made more power but came with the smallest valves. Gen 1 made the least amount of power, but it came with the big valves. I don't know, but that's just how it is. Alright, so next, let's look at the exhaust ports. Alright, so the good thing about the exhaust ports is that they have the same bolt pattern. So you can keep original exhaust. So if you got a Gen 1 bike and you put a Gen 3 cylinder head, the same exhaust will bolt up to the Gen 3 cylinder head the same way as a Gen 1. The only differences are the exhaust port is just slightly bit bigger on the Gen 3 head, just by looking at it, compared to Gen 2. See, there's more material here, and Gen 1. So, but physically, they are the same. The gasket fits. The gasket fits. So you don't have to worry about here. Where's that tape? I'm going to take this one up. Alright, one more thing. Camshaft position sensor. It has the same holes on all 3 generations of cylinder heads. I think one of the generation came with the shorter wire for the cam position sensor. So if you put in the Gen 3 cylinder head on the Gen 2 bike, just put the original cam position sensor from that bike, from that engine, not cylinder head. I don't remember which one was shorter. I thought it was a Gen 1, but I'm not 100% sure. So, alright, next let's look at what happened, what it looks like under the valve cover. So let me flip this one over. Alright, so Gen 1 cylinder head is pretty much the same as a Gen 2 cylinder head. The only difference that I could see was the oiling was improved on the Gen 3 cylinder head. As you can see, these are cam bearings. They're not really bearings, but and this is helps with the oiling to go to the front of the camshaft bearings. The Gen 2 and Gen 1 cylinder heads don't have that. So definitely a better design for a Gen 3. Alright, so let's go over what I just said in this long video. If you decided to swap the heads on your engine from 2004 to 2010 Kawasaki zx10-r, you might have to swap the thermostat housing. Another thing you have to swap is the intake boots. They have to be cylinder head specific. Thermostat housing's got to be engine specific. And cam position sensor, you might have to swap. Everything else bolts right up. Obviously, if you swap in the cylinder heads, don't forget to remap the bike, because dynamics of the engine's going to change. If you put Gen 3 cylinder head but the smaller combustion chambers, the static compression is going to be up. If you swap the Gen 3 camshafts with that too, it's going to change quite a bit. It's going to need more fuel up top, and it's going to need less fuel on the bottom. The ignition timing has to be adjusted as well. So thanks for watching this video, and if you enjoyed this, leave a comment, like, and subscribe.